When I was 21 years old, I managed to get a agent on the basis of a script that I had written. She was a Hollywood agent. She sent it out, and it literally went into limbo for a couple of years. And I decided that I was either going to sit and wait on this thing, or I was going to try to take matters into my own hands.
How did you choose this as a basis for your first film?
Economics. I'm going to have a camera, I'm going to have actors, I'm going to have a house. What's the most interesting scenario? What's the most interesting story that I can create with using those variables? I didn't want to simply do a rehash of the mass serial killer stalking a bunch of kids in the woods who are drinking and partying. A lot of these films that are shot on this kind of budget get the flack that there's not a whole lot of thought put in behind the screenplay, and there's not a whole lot of thought put into the characters, and the plot's just the same thing that you've seen a million times before. And I was really trying to the best of my ability to create something that was more original, like a fresher take on maybe familiar elements.
It has so many elements and so many characters that you're not seeing anymore. People are not taking the time to really, write.
You start off thinking this is the story of a stalker that this kid, Justin, meets, and lo and behold, it turns around and becomes the mystery of what happened to the stalker.
It was interesting because the characters, I felt, had a lot of complexity to them.
The idea of having Justin as a Christian isn't to make some kind of statement. It's simply that I want him to be perceived as this lily-white, conservative character who winds up being just as a human as all the other characters of the piece. I'm a fan of Scorsese's take on Cape Fear, and I love the central character seeming one way only for him to unravel and become just as human as the people around him. Some of the cast I had known already. I wrote characters specifically for Felissa. They're all for Mark Love, Chris Cook, myself. Not particularly flattering characters in any of these cases, but hopefully interesting characters. But I wound up putting casting calls in for all those other roles. Justin was a particularly hard role to cast because you needed somebody who you can believe is kind of an overgrown Boy Scout, and I wound up trying out about 65 people.
It was interesting, though, trying to keep the director's vision in line with my own personality.
When you say lines like...
Just wondering if you have a free moment, if you don't mind taking me on a tour of the town.
It could borderline on utterly ridiculous.
Sometimes I can be a little bit off the wall or out there or further out, and then to have Dave bring me back and just have, bring it down just a little bit more, don't quite do it as big as that or not quite as edgy as that.
Eric was one guy that came in that I could see him as this kind of character. It's not really him per se, but there was a certain quality about him that seemed a nice fit.
I'm not as religiously inclined as Justin is, but I do have a very spiritual approach to life, which I bring to the character and translate in those terms.
What's your experience like working with the actors, and what's your way of nurturing a performance in them?
I think everyone's instinct is to go too big. Usually you don't have to be any bigger than you and I are being right now. So if I'm directing Dave, he does a scene, I just bring him down. Dave, more subtle and a little faster. I just persist with it until it feels really truthful to me, or as truthful as as it can realistically be. David Rigg was literally the last person who came in to try out for that role. It was the end of the day, and I was just thinking I hadn't gotten anybody who's breathing life into that role, and Dave came in.
A criminal's gonna tell you anything you want to hear, just so long as he gets off.
With a wonderfully over-the-top performance, and I thought to myself, this guy's got such charisma.
Who's that?
Vincent Calabrese.
He's out the other window.
All right. Vincent Calabrese.
I knew without a doubt that he had the role. My job was now going to be to scale him back a little bit.
As someone trained in Shakespeare, I know all about overacting. I see a giant spinning spheroid, and it has beings coming out of it, and they have little tentacles on their head. Oh, God, are we going to die so soon?
The first phase of production, I'm going to go out on a limb and say was utterly disastrous. I mean, we had $20,000 to pull the entire thing off. Suddenly, key members of the crew come to you and say, oh, by the way, here's some last-minute expenses, which are basically above and beyond your budget.
You know, he confided in me because, as I said, we have a good friendship, that there were struggles with, always with independent filmmaking, budget and schedules and people, personalities. You can't help that. I mean, I'm sure that's on big budget films as well.
Everything was taking too long. Everything was taking twice as long as I wanted it to take.
So there are a lot of long nights. We put in a lot of hours, and we'd be going till 1, 2 in the morning.
We all ended up staying at the director Dave's house, and there were just not enough beds and not enough couches and not enough floor space. I had one of the photographer's feet inches from my head when I was sleeping most of the night.
Some of us were sleeping in the work vans. When you need to sleep, when you're totally, thoroughly exhausted, you don't care what you sleep on or in.
This particular film was probably the worst experience I've ever had in my life. I was ready to go home. I wanted to go home. I was so uncomfortable and miserable and frustrated.
I don't even think that I slept in the first 3 days of shooting, and they got to a certain point on the third day where my eye literally started moving by itself. I had a key crew member that was so vital to getting everything done right who decided to have a nervous breakdown. The person was working for nothing, and I had to fire them.
I was wondering if there was going to be a day 2.
I don't want to make this sound like this is some diatribe against my crew, because it's not. Like, they were good at what they did. I liked them personally, but the problem was that their whole background is in much bigger budget films. If you bring a bigger budget sensibility to a little tiny indie, you might run into some major problems. We shot less than half the film, I would say, and the entire budget was used up, and I had to pull the plug in the entire thing until I was able to figure out just how I was going to be able to finish it.